So this is our first stop in Nagasaki. Dejima, originally the man-made island to, if you will, sequester the Dutch traders so that there wouldn't be too much of an influence on the natives. As it so happens, it's a small place, about 3 acres wide, only held 15 traders. But you'll notice that I'm standing here on the opposite side, and Dejima is over there, as well as the rest of the city beyond. This place has been filled in quite considerably since then. So, the island is no more. To be sure, not only was the original Dejima reclaimed from the sea, but this isn't even that, since, well, this is Nagasaki. It's had to be rebuilt, restored. Dejima was where the Dutch traders were basically restricted to, and throughout most of the year, it is obviously more than spacious enough for the 15 folks who would stay year-round. I should say the 15 men who stayed year-round, as no women were allowed to speak of. Oh, they had courtesans and geisha, and those from the entertainment district with proper permits were allowed to join, but there were none brought over from the Netherlands or anything like that. Indeed, the place looks absolutely capacious for 15 men. There's about 2 buildings per person, if you want to look at it that way. However, that's during most of the year. Between June and November, when the trading ships would arrive, Dejima would be absolutely swarmed with sailors and merchants and staff and so forth. And it would be, to put it mildly, crowded beyond belief. The Dutch brought cotton, wool, and buckskin to be used as clothing and armor and even scabbards for the Japanese swords, which the Japanese paid for using silver at first and then later in quantities of copper after the shogun was becoming alarmed at the amount of silver flowing out of Japan. They would also trade camphor as medicinal products. But the one thing that the Dutch brought that the Japanese really craved for not having seen it before in their lives was sugar. The Japanese were able to make salt from the ocean easily enough, but sugar was a new thing to them, and as we all know, a fairly addictive product. And they began to use it in everything. Much like in medieval Europe, where putting pepper in everything was a sign of wealth, breeding, good taste, and hospitality, so too putting sugar in everything became a custom, especially here in Nagasaki. Even their tempura apparently has sugar in it, which honestly strikes me as a little distasteful, about the same as putting pepper in one's drink. So it's a matter of, I'm wealthy enough to give you this, that I should be pleased with, but couldn't quite wrap my head around it. Still, Nagasaki is known for having the best confectioners in Japan for this very reason. They've been working with sugar longer than anyone else in the country, whereas it was common here and not so much throughout the rest of the nation. You might notice that I'm mentioning the Dutch in terms of trading with the Japanese. And you might think, wait a minute, their word for bread is pan from the Spanish or the Portuguese. Weren't the Portuguese here first? Yes, indeed they were. They were here nearly a century before the Dutch came. However, the Portuguese brought with them a somewhat militant form of Christianity. And while, to be fair, as I understand it, it was the Spanish whose wrecked ship gave the shogun that much more pause, insofar as there was some realization that there might be an Iberian invasion as part of some kind of holy crusade. It ultimately came to pass that during the rebellions in the 1630s that were as much a tax revolt as they were a reaction to religious repression. But since they used Catholic and specifically Portuguese symbols as part of their rallying banners, the shogun clamped down sufficiently on Catholicism and Christianity in general. The Dutch, being Protestant, weren't filled with the same missionary zeal as those from Iberia, and as a result, were allowed to continue and did so until the mid-1800s. Even during a time when, because of the Napoleonic Wars, the Netherlands as a nation ceased to technically exist. The captains that were stationed in Nagasaki hid this from the shogun and continued to trade. And to be fair, I'm not entirely sure that if the shogun had known it, as long as the goods and the money kept flowing, that it really mattered that much. We're upstairs at the chief factor's office and residence, and as you can see, there are some really large rooms here, in part because the entirety of the Dejima sometimes would be dining here in that vestibule. Many of these rooms are referred by their size, much like the apartments today, which tend to be 4 and 6 rooms, but these are, as you can tell, much larger than that. And again, it's meant as a symbol of status, importance, and wealth. Even the bedroom has enough room for about 15 mats. As you can see how wide it is in either direction. Believe me, someone from Tokyo would kill to have a room this large. For all its spaciousness during the non-peak season, it probably would get pretty boring here with only 15 people and nowhere to go between December and May, as the Dutch were not permitted into the city, let alone into the rest of the country. There was one exception, though. The captain of one of the major ships would occasionally accompany several Japanese officials off to Tokyo proper in order to have an audience with the shogun. And this was a means of intelligence on both sides. The captain would learn things from the shogun and vice versa about what was going on in the wider world and in Japan in particular. This is, of course, the way of both commerce and espionage, where it helps to have some news on the ground in either direction, both as a gesture of goodwill and as a means to understand what else is going on, because no matter how much you might shut your country up, you still need to know what's going on in the rest of the world from time to time. Interestingly, one name that our guide has brought up several times throughout this tour is one who is A, not a merchant or trader, and B, not even Dutch. His name was Dr. Siebold, and while he pretended to be Dutch at some point, was apparently a German expatriate, and he brought certain medical techniques from the West, including that of the cowpox vaccination, which reduced smallpox in Japan. He became the father of Japanese medicine and married a Japanese woman, had a daughter who also learned medicine, became one of the first female doctors in Japan, but also trained many young men in the study of modern medicine, or at least modern at the time. And he is revered throughout the nation for his contributions to Japan and the field of medicine.